Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Veronica LaFemina to talk about building effective teams in a nonprofit, effective remote teams, I should say, in a nonprofit. Veronica, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex. It's great to be here.
So, for people who don't know you yet, I was wondering if you could give a brief intro of who you are and what you do, also known as your superhero origin story.
Sure. So I am an advisor to nonprofit CEOs and department leaders, primarily on organizational strategy and effectiveness, and also leadership and management strategy. I spent the first 10 years of my career working in actually public affairs and creative agencies, working with a lot of nonprofit and association executives in those capacities. And also managing remote teams or multi-office teams to support our clients' work. From there, I went in-house to lead communications departments and strategy departments at national nonprofit organizations here in the US. And over that time, I've had the good fortune to build and lead and merge and grow several different really fantastic teams made up of folks both in office and in remote working environments and hybrid formats as well. So team effectiveness in the nonprofit sector is a big passion of mine. We have amazing people who come to do this work. As part of why I've always wanted to be involved in this sector. So I love the opportunity to talk about really how we can think, plan, and work better as a sector. And so creating really well-functioning teams, whether they be remote, hybrid, in office, or evolving, is something I love working with organizations on.
Awesome. And have you noticed, have you noticed that it was mostly COVID that kind of pushed organizations to be more remote? Or did you find that there were certain organizations that worked well remote even before COVID started?
So it can feel like remote working is this new thing in COVID times. But from my personal experience, remote work has been part of my life actually since I was a teenager. In the corporate world, it was common and remains common for large companies, especially, to have staff spread out across many different locations, and some of those folks working from home. I always joke that my mom is like an OG remote worker because she started working from home, I think, in 1996. So remote work has been with us for a while, but obviously new technology and the number of folks working from home, or the ways that we are enabling folks to work from home or work from some kind of remote space, has changed a lot. And COVID really put a big spotlight on that. For me, I've been remote working actually since 2017. My husband has been remote working for his nonprofit for the past 10 years. So there are some great precedents out there about how folks have been working together for a while. And we have sometimes the amazing opportunity and sort of the overwhelming moment of how do we use all of the technological advances, everything we know about really being a great manager, a great leader, to be intentional about how we help our nonprofit teams work well remotely together and towards our shared mission and business objectives.
Actually, I'm in the same boat as you. I think I started working remotely around 2017 as well. And then it became in vogue, stylish, or in trend because of COVID, of course. But it's good to see that there was at least some precursor to it before. And now, I guess, like you said, the technology has just made it easier and more acceptable to be more remote.
Yeah. And I think that technology, can be great and challenging, right? As someone who lives with a hearing disability and who wears hearing aids, when I was working remotely and we were relying on just conference calls to connect with folks, that could be really hard for me when there weren't great norms in the room about making sure how we include folks on the line. As a facilitator, I used to think about that often when we were doing more audio calls in that way. And so the advent of video calling has been amazing for so many reasons. And also, it sometimes got us into a bad habit of defaulting to a video call, defaulting to using that to create community or to move work along, when in fact, those calls weren't always necessary. Or similarly, like meetings aren't always necessary to move work forward. So I think it is, a great advancement in some ways, but also just requires us to be really thoughtful about which tools we use in what cases, so that everyone on the team can have their needs met, but that we're also, not defaulting to certain methods that, out of comfort or because that's how we're used to doing it.
And I definitely want to get into some of those details. But before we do, just to go higher level, at this point in time, as more and more organizations try to convince employees to return to the office, there seems to be 3 different camps. The first one is remote work. We want to say either remote workers, or the organization says it's okay to stay remote as workers. There's the, come in the office 5 days a week to the way things used to be. And then there's this hybrid model, which is kind of a mix between the two. And that would obviously vary between organization to organization. Some might say come into the office 2, maybe 3 times a week and stay at home for the remaining days, which I'm reading more and more. It tends to be one of the better choices for us, at least better than being in the office full time, because it gives a certain amount of flexibility, a certain amount of freedom and empowerment to the employer, or employee rather. And I was just curious to know, what have you noticed, I guess, recently in trends in terms of nonprofits and working remotely or hybrid or in the office?
It's interesting because I think we're seeing a lot more demand for return to work in the corporate sector. There are a lot of companies that may have bigger commercial office spaces, right, that they've rented, and they're trying to figure out how to use that space effectively. They may feel the need to rebuild a sense of connection and camaraderie. Oftentimes that's because managers feel like if they can see the people on their team, that gives them maybe a false sense of control or understanding, what kind of work is actually getting done. In the nonprofit sector, I think it's been different in different geographies for different sizes of organizations. And also based on the kind of work the organization does, right? If you are a direct service provider where your staff are interfacing with members of the community every day, it's really critical that you have folks, in-house or on site at least a certain number of days a week. If that's your business model, if that's how you operate, you have to figure out how you want to approach that, and for some folks in those roles, just maybe an understanding that this is, full time in the office. For other organizations, they may be more creative and flexible with how can we do this in a hybrid manner? What work really needs to be on site versus can be done in a remote environment, and can we intentionally design our work rhythms or schedules or the way we provide services to make that happen. I think something that gets tricky is we, in the nonprofit world, care a lot about equity, and we sometimes get equity confused with equality, right? So an all remote environment we might say is equal, right? Everyone's getting the chance to be 100% remote. And there may be some benefits to that, but it may not actually help everybody perform their job the best. There might be roles that it is crucial for folks to be on site together and working together. And so I think really coming at the work environment from a perspective of what is our operating model, what work there really requires either on-site presence or in-person collaboration, and what doesn't. Also, there might be a category of work where we're not sure if it requires in person. Like we think it would be good to have it, but we don't know that it's necessarily required. And so kind of laying that out and then looking at the staff we have, the roles that they fill, and which of those roles kind of aligns to which parts of that work, and figuring out how we can give folks what they need so we can set them up for success while not seeming to have like a systematic, well, these people can be remote workers and these not. Like there will be differentiation, but how can we support staff members in a way that's healthy and still gets the work of the organization done. And for me, I'm a big believer in helping staff, having them very involved in designing what that looks like, right? And creating our team norms around remote working, or really contributing to seeing what models they think would work best and that they want to test. I think sometimes organizations try to get this right from the get-go, and they spend 6 months, 9 months researching, planning, and then they put it together, and there's been a lot of hard work, and then inevitably there's something that was overlooked or something that doesn't feel quite right. So getting into a mode of testing out certain models for a certain period of time and coming back and saying, okay, what worked about that, what didn't, gives us a chance to create a working structure that is most effective for our individual organization.
I actually like that testing mode idea, because this way you're not trying to commit to a very long or indefinite period of time. You can say, look, let's just try this approach, this particular approach designed together for, a month, 2 months, 3 months, and then have a debrief to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and then pivot, change, adopt as needed. It's almost like that agile methodology of delivering projects. And what I picked up was, in terms of offering the possibility of working remotely, it sounds like it's based on two main factors. What is the position or the role the person is trying to do? And what is their own personal interests as well, their individual interests? And I guess it's a combination. It sounds like the combination of the two would put them into one of those three categories of remote versus in office versus hybrid. Would you say that would be a good assessment, or would you have a different spin to that?
Absolutely. I think it's hard to know what people want until we have those conversations with them, right? So we can make assumptions that, for example, if in our department or on our team, we have 3 different working parents, we might make assumptions that all of them would prefer to be remote, right? And that could be true for one working parent. For another one, they might be okay with that scenario, but still would like to come into the office from time to time. And another one might say, no, I really need to be at the office to focus. Like, I don't have the space at home to really be in work mode, or it's important to me to have a strong separation between work and home. So those individual preferences are important. We can't always use those for governing 100%, because if you're someone who likes to be a remote worker, but your role has a lot to do with physical activities in the office, right? Like maybe you're fulfilling certain supplies or packaging things, like those, that role and that preference don't go together, right? So it might be a good conversation to say, is there another role that could be remote that this team member skills could be used in? Or how can we come to a fair agreement that enables that, physical and office work to be done, while recognizing that things like inventory, management checks or things like that could be done remotely on certain days.
From the ED perspective and building a nonprofit culture, how would an ED, or how could an ED organize and keep track of people if some are working remotely, some are in the office, and some are hybrid? Are there certain methodologies or tools or principles or guidelines that they can follow to be able to accommodate these 3 different categories of workers or volunteers even?
So it's interesting, because when we were all working in in-office environments, there were a lot of shortcuts we could take with respect to being clear about our expectations and what it looks like to successfully meet those expectations, right? Sometimes that would be just, we're here together, we all jump into a meeting, and because we like that energy for brainstorming, or it was nice to have everyone accessible, we have this idea that that is how work should look, right? But in a remote environment, especially when people are primarily working independently throughout the day, getting really clear about our expectations, our behavior norms, and helping folks on board into that are all really important. And frankly, a lot of leaders aren't given the professional development, right? Aren't kind of shown how to help integrate folks into our organization's way of working. We kind of take pride in the nonprofit sector of like, we just hit the ground running and people jump in and it's flexible and adaptive. And there are some strong, like really helpful qualities there, but it can be easy to get disorganized, right? Or easy to not understand, what the priorities are, what we're working on. And so forth. So whether it's an executive director or a department head at a larger organization, I think, first of all, it's okay to admit that you're not an expert at this, right? Most of us are learning how to manage teams remotely in the time we're in. So when we admit that we're not an expert, then we don't have to be the one to come up with all the answers. I really encourage an approach where we have 2 to 3 team members who have an interest in shaping our culture as an organization, working together to research what are people saying about this now? We're a couple years in. Are there best practices? Are there more effective ways of using the tools we already have that we've already implemented, in COVID times, perhaps, to do this well? And then having those team members talk to other folks, around the organization or in the department and come up with a set of recommendations for, first of all, what's the set of tools that we're going to use to support ourselves, and using that set of tools, what's our cadence for meetings, for like how we check in with each other, what the expectation is around response times, how we track our work and get it done. We also probably want to have a conversation about working styles and what information people need to be able to provide their best work, so that we're reducing the misunderstanding that can happen a lot in an environment where we're maybe primarily communicating via email or, Slack message or Teams message. So I think, that's kind of a lot there, but my main thing with leaders is you don't have to build this alone. In fact, it's better if you have your team build it with you, because then those folks are more bought in. Other staff members want to support their colleagues who put the time and effort into putting this together. And you get to speak with one another about, okay, this is what we're going to try for the next 3 months or 6 months. Here's when we're going to check in. And as we go, we'll collect ideas or opportunities for continuing to tweak and improve. But I think it's okay to, start with a couple of core things related to expectations and technology and onboarding, and then build from there.
I really like that expression that I'm not an expert, so I don't need to have all the answers. That's so true. And it's okay not to be an expert. You don't have to be an expert in everything. So to build or to start with something and then build from there is a fantastic approach. I love it. I'm curious then. So you mentioned tools. I got like five points: tools, cadence of meetings, response times, fourth one, and then working styles, tracking work. Oh yeah, tracking work. So I agree with you that I think a lot of organizations really like having their employees back in the office because of that false sense of security that you mentioned, of tracking their work, feeling like they're working. What would be some suggestions that you have to department heads or EDs to be able to allow them to track their employees' work or the progress of the work and have a sense of that the employees are still doing the work, that they should be empowered to be able to do the work at their own schedule, at their own pace? There's a balance between giving freedom to the employee and letting them do their work. And the other side is tracking their work, making sure they are actually working and not quietly quitting or other non-effective means of working. So how would you balance the two, or what would be your recommendations or suggestions to department heads and EDs in that respect?
It's really important to know what is the work that needs to get done. So coming from public affairs and working closely in creative agencies and with folks who are sort of natural brainstormers, bouncing off one another, there's a difference between, here are the actual deliverables or the work that needs to be completed or accomplished by a certain time, and other great ideas that come up along the way. for leaders who are trying to figure out, how do I know if people are working? It's not so much, that you're over their shoulder all the time, because I can assure you, your workers in the office were not working all the time, right? They were chatting with colleagues over coffee breaks. They were potentially, buying their vacation airline tickets, whatever the case may be. So this isn't about the fact that people are working all these hours that we perceived that they were working in the office before. So we need to use different measures, right? We need to be really clear about what the work is that folks are working toward over the next month, 2 months, 3 months. I really recommend that leaders choose a schedule check-in that matches their work. So for some organizations that are very fast-paced and might need to be tracking metrics on a more regular basis, they might have like a 10-minute daily stand-up meeting just to make sure everyone's got what they need before they're doing direct connections with clients or beneficiaries. For other organizations that might have a longer timeline on when they're going to see progress, it really might be that a shared document or a shared task list in like their MS Teams or their Google Drive or whatever technology they're using is just where people check in, right? That they check in on a regular time to see where things are, and that if deliverables are owed to management, that those are making it on time. The thing that I think leaders, can be give themselves a little like comfort or relax a little bit about is make sure you're seeing your team's work, right? If the quality is good and if they're getting it done on time, you don't need to worry about what they're working on every single day, right? They might come up with a better way of working where they're more effective in producing higher quality content for you as they experiment with what works. The key is to make sure that your expectations are clear about due dates, about when folks are going to check in, about how folks participate in team meetings when we are having that synchronous work time together, and creating enough space then for those asynchronous moments to happen. We're humans. People are easily distracted. And I think we can sometimes feel pressured that everyone's got to be like super efficient and getting everything done well. But just because you're sitting at your desk turning on work doesn't mean that the quality is high, right? Or that it's actually accomplishing the objectives or advancing the strategy that you're working on.
I totally agree. And I think there are so many different working styles that the old method of 9 to 5 in the office might fit some, but not all. Personally, for example, I'm not a morning person. It takes me a long time to get going, to get the gears running. Once I do, everything is fine, but it's a long start to the morning. So I'd much rather have like a schedule from 11 till even 8 p.m. at night, just because that fits with my schedule. And working remotely like I do as well, I can decide on when I want to work and how I want to work and how long I want to work for. But you're right. It's at the end of the day, it's the work that's produced. It's making sure that if there are any milestones and checkpoints to meet, that you do meet them. So like these daily check-ins, weekly meetings, I think are great strategies for employers to check in with employees to make sure that work is progressing, but then have the confidence in the worker that they're doing the work in a way that works for them and not just have to fit into a mold of 9 to 5, turn on the computer, turn off the computer and walk away type of thing.
Yeah. And I think, there are sort of middle ground things here where there's like a base hours of availability or in the office, so that if someone does have a question that they need to reach a colleague on, they can reasonably expect that they may be available then. So some organizations take that, especially orgs that are across different time zones. But maybe, like everyone's in the US, for example, but you've got 3 different, have the 3-hour time difference. Like here are the core hours that we expect people to be available. That's something to experiment with. If you're a smaller org, that may not be as necessary, right? You may not have as many teammates that you're keeping track of, but you as a leader may need to, again, adjust your own expectations of if you were used to just like walking down the hall and interrupting someone's work to get a question answered or giving, texting them or calling their cell. Part of this is not that remote work should turn into full-time, availability, which it can in some cases, right? That's a boundary that needs to be set. But it's important, I think, for leaders also to have a good sense of what is, the staff member's general working day, right? Like they usually are online by 11, and I know that they're available later in the evening sometimes too. And I think having clear expectations there is helpful, because there are times, and I'll say for myself as a leader who used to rely on like picking up the phone to ask a quick question instead of getting into like a long email back and forth. I needed to, temper my own expectations about like how fast the response time would be, or if someone would even be available to take that call right away. And so a big part of this is, slowing down all of like the doing and activity to really think about how do we work better as a team, leveraging everyone's superpowers and knowing, letting ourselves understand like our employees know themselves, like they know when they do their best work. We hired great people to be part of advancing our mission. And so we can still, provide important structure and guidelines and expectations so that we're communicating well and all on the same page. But that we too, as leaders, may need to adjust our behavior and expectations to accommodate the fact that we're taking an approach that helps us get the best out of everyone on our team.
Yeah, I like the idea as well of having at least a core period of time where you are reliably sure you can call a meeting if you need to. It doesn't need to be, 9 to 5 like we mentioned, but let's say, 10 to 1 kind of thing, depending on the time zones you're in. At least it's with relative confidence, you can say if you schedule a meeting between those times, everyone, in quotes, will be able to attend. And there's another example, and it was an article I read not so long ago. We talked a bit about it before we started hitting the record button, about full asynchronous work. There's an organization called GitLab. It's a software company. And these guys have gone full in or 100% into async work, which means no meetings, no phone calls. Everything is done in each person's own time. And there's like a whole article. I can link it in the show notes below. But the idea is it allows people, there's like 6 benefits they mention, but it allows people to work at their own schedule. It gives them more autonomy, more power. You can have people across the world, across the time zones, and still work effectively. I mean, maybe they might reduce the actual throughput, in terms of a few hours or whatever per day, because there is a bit of gaps. But the benefits, to me at least, seem to outweigh the cons. And one of them we talked about was inclusion. So the idea of, let's just maybe define what async works is. And the idea is that you're just doing everything in your own time, right? So you only send work to be done to a particular person when that work is ready to be scheduled by that person. And that person will do their work and then hand it off to the next person as needed. And the principle going into this is, how can I deliver this message? How can I present my work, or how can I move the project forward, believing that everybody at this moment, everyone in the office is asleep? So what can I do to progress things in that situation, which is a lovely frame of mind. So given that, one of the benefits that we talked about was inclusion, because to your point, there are some people who have certain deficiencies or not always able to think of something maybe on the fly, or just have the time that they need to be able to do good work, and async work can support that. So I was just curious to know if you could share your perspective about async work and what your thoughts are in general about it.
Absolutely. And so to clarify there, when we're talking about inclusion in this place, we're talking about inclusion across like a whole spectrum of things. So that might be making sure we're being more inclusive for our employees who have a disability. There are lots of great articles out right now and that have been put out over the past couple of years about how remote working is helping us as a society really better include, but also tap into the incredible superpowers of people living with disability who can contribute their expertise and their sort of solution-oriented adaptability to our work in new ways, because we've made work from home way more accessible. For other, folks, whether, again, like we kind of talked about working parents before, there might be folks who are caring for a family member, or folks who are just, night owls and do their best work at 2 a.m. I like to think about this really as like, how can we unlock everyone's superpower, right? How do we optimize the talent and the tools that we already have, rather than focusing on acquiring more or adding more. So async work, it's similar to remote work, really requires us to be thoughtful about what is our way of working as an organization, and how do we stay on the same page about that, right? So it requires good documentation. It requires advanced planning, right? Which, again, in the nonprofit sector, for many of our organizations, everyone feels like they're kind of handling everything, lots of fires, lots of high intensity, high speed work. And that environment is not conducive to async. So if we're going to really think about how do we include people, how do we do asynchronous work well, we have to first stop doing certain things. I talk about with my strategic planning clients and the advisory work I do, that we really have to plan to do much less than we're doing right now. And that feels scary for folks to be like, oh, we're going to be less productive, we're not doing as many things. But often what it gives us the opportunity to do is focus on what we do really well. And so when we focus on what we do really well, it gets better to document our processes for doing that, how we communicate with one another, who needs to see things in which order to be able to move it along as everyone else is sleeping, as you mentioned. The opportunity that asynchronous work presents too is for us to, understand a little bit better, what does it actually take to do these programs well? Again, for companies or for nonprofits that really most of their work is, desk work or online work, that, async work may be more feasible than for organizations that have like a strong physical presence or are interacting directly with clients or beneficiaries on a regular basis. But still, in that case, by having good documentation, handbooks, how-to guides, processes really written out, and not just written out, but I would suggest doing video walkthroughs as well, or making things available in an audio format for folks who that's their preferred way of learning. It can help us, it can help an organization use something like async work to advance things without feeling like everybody's got to be in the meeting all at once. I think something that nonprofits struggle with sometimes is we may be so used to doing that we don't always know what actually is like the most effective or efficient or like the best way of delivering something we deliver. We may just do, and we're relying on people to invest extra hours or work, the equivalent of 2 or 3 jobs to get everything done. And like that is not a model that is sustainable or scalable. So when we're talking about the impact we want to have in our communities, we have to have a gut check, a reality check with ourselves about, are we already operating in a way where we're not actually doing what we're saying we're doing, because it's taking so many extra resources, so much extra time. So I think the opportunity that asynchronous work provides is to say, how can we get really clear about the best way for us to advance our mission? What's the order of operations, and how do we help folks go through that process? Either like a step-by-step process, or what happens when we need to collaborate, what happens when we need to make a decision. And I think in some environments, fully async can be a little harder because sometimes a conversation really is what's needed, but that shouldn't always be the default, right? We shouldn't just default to meeting unless we have a really clear purpose for that meeting, like a clear agenda, any decisions we're trying to make sure get made, and what happens after this meeting. So I think there's a ton of opportunity there. And it can also, be about the culture of your organization too. Because for some folks, work is an important part of, their social framework and how they connect with others. And they may prefer an environment where there is more synchronous work to asynchronous. But that's a choice an organization gets to make about the culture it wants to create.
Even if you don't fully adopt asynchronous work, which I think is almost an ideal or an end goal that not everyone, to your point, will be able to achieve, there are certain principles, like you mentioned, of it that I think can be used. The idea of just asking yourself the question, are we really doing the right thing? Is our operating model really successful? Are we just doing things for the sake of doing it, or are we actually advancing things? And just asking that question and going through existing documentation, existing processes, existing operating models, and challenging some of those models is a fantastic thing to do. I always remind myself of the story of the 5 monkeys, which is a longer story I won't share with you now. But the idea is that sometimes when people just do things because that's the way they've always done things. And I always challenge people to take a moment every once in a while to ask themselves, do we really need to have this? Do we really need to have this meeting? Are there other ways to accomplish the same goal in a better way, whatever better means for you, but without having to have a meeting where everyone has to get their calendars aligned and timetables and so forth. So definitely elements of the async work can be applied, I think, to a lot of organizations, even the ones that are, customer facing, client facing, providing services that have to be done in person.
Yeah. I think the other thing that plays in here in a big way, Alex, is role clarity. So we talked a little bit, and I didn't use this term, but we talked about the organization having strategic clarity, right? What's our role in our ecosystem? Like, what's our vision and mission and our values, right? And how we live that. But it's really important for us to, as an organization, to know what our role is. Like, if we're trying to be a convener and a direct service provider and an advocate and an educator and an expert, it gets very complicated to do all that well, right? And in the social sector, our role, I believe, is a bit more prominent, and we need more clarity around it than necessarily in the for-profit sector, where we're really, many of the business models are about sort of, surprising and delighting the customer, and the customer pays, and then we're good. Like, that's not how most of nonprofit operating models work. And so we need to be clear the role we play so that we can continue to then deliver either the best programs, the best advocacy work, whatever we're focused on in that space. So that strategic clarity really matters. Doing less, right, or focusing our efforts on the things we do best really matters. But then we also need role clarity among staff, right? Part of why we have meetings, and I'll say I'm someone who enjoys meetings. I'm a facilitator. I love hearing other people's thinking. I feel like there's a lot we can learn from each other's expression and body language. And so, I'm not like a no meetings ever kind of human, but I think it's important for us to know, like, why are we meeting? And is it because, the procedures or expectations we have put in place don't apply in this situation? Is it that we genuinely like want everyone's great creative input on something, and the in-person element matters because we need to be able to like physically draw things out together, or whatever the case may be, right? There are different reasons for it. But role clarity, right? Who your decision makers are, who has the authority to do what thing, is crucial, because without that, you have a lot of people kind of off doing their own work, but not an understanding of, well, who gets to make the call on this. So I talk to organizations sometimes about providing decision guidance to their staff, and especially for decisions that we make regularly, right? Like things that are common, how can we document them, document who has the decision-making authority there, and give that person guidance for, here's generally what we do in this situation. That can sound like, well, we're over processing it, but actually it removes a lot of the stress that like too many choices, too many decisions tends to put on us as humans. So that we're saying like, 80% of our work or 75% of our work, we know how to handle it, right? We follow this process, or here's who's got the decision-making rights on it. We move forward rather than having every new occurrence be an opportunity for conversation or an opportunity for us to question, the way that we've done it already. And so, in the article you mentioned, I think there's like some great information about the importance of documentation. And I would say specifically in nonprofit world, getting really clear on decision-making rights is an area where a lot of organizations can improve. So that we're all working together as a team and we recognize each other's authority, and we recognize that we have our own authority in our situation too.
Regarding the role clarity, I agree with that. And I don't know if it's just for projects, but in Salesforce projects, we use what's called RACI, which is an acronym that stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And the basic idea is you build a grid of defining who is responsible for a particular action, who is accountable for an action, who is consulted during the action, and who has to be informed of an action or a decision. And having that kind of clarity at the beginning of a project is really important, so you know who does what and who is responsible and who is accountable and all that kind of stuff. So that's something that's very popular, and I think a lot of nonprofits could leverage that to help them identify who does what.
Yeah, I think there's some great, RACI is definitely a common one, and there are some other models out there too, like the rapid roles for effective decision making. So it's RAPID. And similarly, it's really trying to think about role, but that one is dependent on like the action. So it's recommend, agree, perform, provide input, and then decide. And so using models like that, I think that's, I guess, just maybe something else to double click on here, Alex, is there are lots of great resources out there, right? Again, like kind of calling back to the beginning of our conversation, remote work has been around for a long time. There are lots of organizations that actually have figured out ways to do this well. And so when we can use frameworks like that, when we can use our tools well, a lot of organizations, when it comes to technology, for example, maybe are not optimizing the suite that they've already invested in, whether that's Microsoft or, Google or any of the CRMs they're using. Most of the time we haven't like fully optimized that tool, and we default to like, oh, we need something else, and we kind of acquire something different or add on a new free tool or something, and we end up creating more complexity instead of just getting really good at using what we've got or enhancing what we've got. And so, like whether it's these frameworks, whether it's the tools and guidelines other organizations have already come up with, whether it's, getting really good at maximizing the tools we have already, there's a lot of great resource to work with, or a lot of great resource to help our team, to ask our team to go explore when they research and come back to us with some recommendations. And we have to be willing, though, to say, like, the way we work matters. The way we work influences and drives everything we do. And so if we can find a way of working that enables us to unlock people's superpowers, ensures that we, have a respectful, inclusive culture where everyone is empowered to do their best work, and a way of working that helps us get better at doing what we do best and repeating that and refining it over time, it's worth it to spend the time to figure out those elements and which models we want to give a try and test and iterate with. We're not, I talk to leaders a lot about, like, we're not looking for an A+ on the report card here. That's not the point. It's not that you're 100% right or you're 100% the expert. We're looking for, great innovation in your organization. We're looking for a way of testing and learning so that what we create together is effective and builds the kind of culture and has the kind of impact we want as an organization.
I like that tagline too, unlocking your superpower. That's an awesome title. So looking to trends today and looking forward to future trends, like there's a big push-pull now still with that remote work versus in-office versus hybrid. I'm curious to know, what is your perspective? What trends have you seen or are expecting to see in the near future? Do you think we'll solve, or at least not maybe it's necessarily solve, but find a balance between how to work remotely versus hybrid, or maybe some other method? Like, I'm just curious to know, what do you see happening in the short-term future for working remotely?
I think one of the biggest things that's going to influence this, Alex, is the continued rise of the gig economy, right? So by 2030, I think it is something like 70% of US adults will be participating in the gig economy in some way. And that, obviously doesn't all mean freelancing for like desk job kind of stuff. But I do think the fact that we are going to see more teams that are hybrids of in-house staff versus like contracting staff or, highly skilled freelance staff is going to keep shaping how this work rolls out. Because if we're comfortable bringing on contractors or consultants into certain roles or to participate in a certain way in our organizations, that is going to influence the way we use technology, the systems that we have. And so I think, again, like for every organization, it's going to be a little bit different. But if we can stick to here's like what our operating model really truly does need, like, here are the things that absolutely need to be done in person or absolutely need to be done, together, right? Barring another global health emergency. How can we keep designing for that future? So I don't know that there's no one right answer for everyone, right? I'm hopeful that organizations' continued exploration of different models and then talking about those models and what's working for them and why is going to lead to better ways of working in the sector. Remote working and async work can't address all of the, maybe culture challenges or workload challenges in and of themselves. But we certainly, are in a time where we seem to be more open to how to best leverage the emerging technologies that are, out here in the working world. We seem to be in a time where we're better understanding that there are folks who've been left out of the workforce for a long time who now have the opportunity to participate more fully. And we seem to be at a time when we're understanding that society is changing, family life is changing, friend life, community life is changing. So I think we're going to keep seeing organizations work on what's the right balance here. And I also think, as organizations choose, okay, here's what we want to do and here's our culture, that is going to play a big role in the ability to attract really talented professionals. It is, if we're insisting everyone be in an office and we need everyone to work locally, then strategically we're saying, okay, we're limiting the pool of people who we can hire, right? Or who we can bring on because of the way we're working. And if that's a trade-off we're willing to make, that is fine. But we have to go into that with eyes open and not then be surprised when we're not, filling the roles that we have that are open, or when folks just aren't as interested in participating in that, in maybe a fully in-person workplace anymore.
Awesome. Lots of great information here today. Thank you so much. Where can people find more about you online? Get in touch, maybe if they have follow-up questions.
Absolutely. So I'm very active on LinkedIn and encourage folks to look me up there, Veronica LaFemina. You can also learn more about my work to help organizations and nonprofit CEOs and department heads think, plan, and work better at my website, lafemina.co. I blog regularly about nonprofit leadership and management, culture, and strategy topics there. So it's a good resource for lots of just further reading on some of these topics about how our organizations and teams work.
We'll definitely put the links in the show notes below. Veronica, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Alex. It's been great to be here with you.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.